Section 1. The Capture. January 30th, 1943. The burning sands of North Africa shimmered under the noonday sun. The last pockets of the German Afrika Korps huddled in makeshift trenches outside Tunis, their once proud panzers now smoking wrecks on the horizon. Dust clung to every man's face. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and surrender. Corporal Hans Meyer, a 26-year-old radio operator from Dusseldorf, wiped the grime from his eyes as he watched a column of American Shermans roll past. They were enormous, monstrous machines that dwarfed his own half-track. The stars and stripes painted on their sides gleamed in the light. Behind them, trucks, hundreds of them, carried supplies, water, and ammunition in endless lines that stretched beyond sight. For Meyer and his comrades, the realization came slowly, painfully. They weren't losing because they lacked courage. They were losing because the enemy had everything. More fuel, more food, more guns, more trucks. Even now, as prisoners, the Americans gave them water before questioning them. "You have no idea what you're up against," an American sergeant muttered, tossing him a canteen. When the order finally came to march, the German prisoners were herded toward the coast, thousands of them. Dust clouds rose with every step. The desert that had once been their battlefield had become their graveyard of pride. From the docks at Bizerta, they were loaded onto Liberty ships, hundreds at a time, bound for a destination they couldn't yet imagine. As the ship engines roared to life and the African coast faded into the horizon, Hans leaned against the steel railing. "Where are they taking us?" one soldier asked. "America," someone replied. The word hung in the air, heavy and unreal. America, the enemy's homeland, the land of machines, factories, and wealth. No one laughed. No one spoke. They were about to see the beating heart of the power that had crushed the Reich's ambitions, and for the first time, they would see it up close. Section 2. The Crossing. February 1943. Mid-Atlantic. The Liberty ship SS Thomas Paine pitched violently through the winter waves, its steel hull groaning under the strain. Below deck, hundreds of German POWs sat shoulder to shoulder, packed into dim, oil-scented quarters lined with bunks and steel piping. The sound of the ocean hammered against the hull like artillery. Corporal Hans Meyer lay awake, staring at the flickering light bulb above him. The rhythmic thud of the ship's engines echoed through the metal walls, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. Every few seconds, a deep rumble would shake the floor, followed by a burst of steam hissing from the pipes. It was unlike anything he had experienced. The men whispered quietly in the dark. Some spoke of home, others of escape. But most were silent, haunted by the same realization. "How do they build so many of these ships?" one man asked in disbelief. "We lose freighters faster than we can launch them. And these Americans, they build one every few days." Hans had no answer. He remembered seeing endless convoys off the African coast, dozens of ships loaded with tanks, fuel, and food, escorted by destroyers with radar dishes spinning like ghostly halos. He began to understand why Germany was losing. Everywhere he looked on the Thomas Paine, efficiency reigned. American sailors worked in quiet synchronization, their uniforms clean, their tools labeled, their movements precise. Even the meals shocked the Germans. Hot stew, bread, and coffee served 3 times a day. "They feed prisoners like this?" muttered one Luftwaffe mechanic. "Our own soldiers barely eat this well at the front." Above deck, the vastness of the convoy unfolded. Liberty ships, oil tankers, troop transports, all moving in formation like a steel armada stretching to the horizon. The sky was gray, the air cold, and the ocean endless. But there was something almost divine about the scale of it all. Hans leaned against the rail one morning as the sun rose through the mist. The reflection of the convoy shimmered across the waves, and he whispered to himself, "So this is America's secret weapon." It wasn't just guns. It wasn't just planes. It was capacity, industry, organization, a system that never slept. The journey lasted nearly 2 weeks. When land finally appeared, a faint line of gray against the cold Atlantic mist, the ship erupted in murmurs. Some thought it was England, others Canada. But as the skyline grew clearer, they saw cranes, smokestacks, and endless rail lines. New York Harbor, the beating industrial heart of the modern world. Section 3. The Arrival. March 1st, 1943, New York Harbor. A heavy fog clung to the bay as the SS Thomas Paine glided past the Statue of Liberty. The German prisoners crowded along the railings, silent. For many, it was the first time they had ever seen America, and it was nothing like what Goebbels' propaganda had promised. Instead of a land of chaos and corruption, they saw order. Cranes moved in mechanical rhythm, loading and unloading supplies from ships in every direction. Freight trains rumbled along parallel tracks beside the docks. Workers in helmets and coveralls operated machines with practiced precision. The skyline loomed in the distance, steel towers that seemed to scrape the clouds. Hans Meyer gripped the railing, unable to look away. "Mein Gott," he whispered, "they have factories, as far as the eye can see." For men who had grown up in the bomb-scarred cities of Europe, America was a different planet. The docks were alive with movement, trucks hauling crates of ammunition, forklifts stacking oil drums, welders throwing sparks beneath towering gantries. Everything was loud, efficient, and endless. As the prisoners disembarked, they were herded into neat lines by American MPs. There was no shouting, no striking, no humiliation. The guards were young, most barely out of high school, yet they carried themselves with confidence. Their uniforms were clean, their rifles polished. "You'll be treated fair," one sergeant said flatly. "Just follow the rules." The Germans expected barbed wire and guard dogs. Instead, they were loaded into warm troop trains. The engines hissed, the wheels clanked, and soon the convoy rolled westward through the industrial arteries of a nation at war. Through the windows they watched a landscape of abundance. Miles of farmland blanketed in snow. Freight yards filled with coal cars, towns with neon signs, gas stations, and movie theaters still running. "They're not starving," one prisoner murmured. "They're thriving." When the train passed a factory complex in Ohio, Hans saw something that broke his composure completely. A line of new Sherman tanks rolling off an assembly line. One every few minutes. Men and women in coveralls waved at the passing train, unaware that the men staring back were their enemies. Hans turned to his friend, a former panzer driver. "They build tanks like we build bicycles," he said quietly. "How could we ever hope to keep up?" The train thundered westward through the night, carrying its human cargo deeper into the American heartland. Some prisoners tried to sleep, others prayed, but most sat in silence, watching through the glass as an industrial empire rolled by. Vast, unstoppable, and utterly beyond comprehension. For the first time, many of them realized Germany hadn't just lost the war on the battlefield. It had lost it in the factories.
Section 4. The Camps of Plenty. March 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The train screeched to a halt under the southern sun. The prisoners squinted through the dusty windows as the doors opened, revealing a sprawling complex surrounded not by concrete walls but by simple barbed wire fences. American guards in wide-brimmed hats stood at ease, smoking cigarettes. Beyond them, rows of wooden barracks, a watchtower, and what looked like a baseball field. As the Germans stepped down from the train, they exchanged uneasy glances. This didn't look like a prison. There were no dogs, no shouting guards, no gray barracks of despair like the concentration camps they knew back home. Instead, they were met with the smell of freshly baked bread and diesel from the camp's kitchen trucks. Inside, each prisoner was assigned a cot, a blanket, and a metal tray for meals. The dining hall stunned them. Hot food served 3 times a day: beef stew, potatoes, bread, and even coffee. It was more than many of them had eaten at the front in months. "If this is captivity," one man whispered, "then what is our army fighting for?" Everywhere they saw the quiet efficiency of American logistics: laundry stations with industrial washing machines, medical tents stocked with clean bandages and sulfa powder, a library filled with English books, Red Cross parcels with chocolate, cigarettes, and soap. It was a world away from the bombed-out ruins of Europe. The guards were firm but fair. They didn't curse or beat the prisoners. Orders were clear, schedules strict. Roll call, work detail, recreation. Soon a rhythm took hold. Some Germans were sent to work on nearby farms, others in sawmills or factories under supervision. In exchange, they received tokens to buy soda, candy, or even cigarettes from the camp canteen. Then came the greatest shock of all: Coca-Cola. Served ice-cold in glass bottles, the fizzy sweetness was like nothing they had ever tasted. "It's like drinking happiness," joked a young Luftwaffe mechanic, his teeth stained with sugar. Later that week came ice cream, vanilla, soft, melting under the Mississippi heat. The prisoners laughed like schoolboys. Hans Meyer sat outside one evening watching a group of POWs play baseball with the guards. The crack of the bat echoed under the pink sky. "They give us games, food, books," he muttered. "Our propaganda told us America was dying from decadence. But this isn't decadence. This is abundance." Night fell. The camp lights flickered on, illuminating neat rows of barracks. The hum of generators filled the air. In the distance, a train horn wailed, another shipment of supplies heading toward the front. Hans realized something then. The Americans weren't just rich, they were organized. Their power wasn't in brutality, but in order. Back in Germany, men like him had fought for the Reich, believing they were part of the most advanced nation on earth. But here, in captivity, among their enemies, they were discovering a truth that shattered everything they'd been taught. Section 5. The Revelation. April 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Weeks passed, and the routine of captivity settled into something almost domestic. The men woke at dawn, saluted out of habit, and filed to breakfast beneath a flag that wasn't theirs. But what began as quiet obedience soon turned into fascination. One morning, a group of prisoners was escorted beyond the wire to work on a nearby construction site, a new grain storage facility being built by local contractors. As they marched past rows of bulldozers, cranes, and trucks, their disbelief deepened. Machines, hundreds of them, operated with a precision and abundance they had never seen. Each truck was brand new. Each crane bore the stamp of an American manufacturer. Hans Meyer stopped in his tracks, watching sparks fly from an acetylene torch. "They have more machines here than we have tanks," he whispered. Later, as they worked under the watchful eyes of the guards, one prisoner, an engineer from Stuttgart, began quietly counting the trucks in view. 37, he murmured, and this is just one site. Back home, I waited 6 weeks for one part to arrive. That evening, when the men returned to camp, they couldn't stop talking. It wasn't the food or the kindness that astonished them anymore. It was the scale, the system. The realization that America's power wasn't built on miracle weapons, but on organization, production, and relentless motion. A week later, the camp administration allowed them to attend a Sunday service in town, under guard. As the trucks drove past the nearby rail yard, the prisoners saw an endless procession of freight cars loaded with steel, coal, and lumber, all stamped U.S. Army Transportation Corps. The sight drew silence. No one spoke for a full minute. Hans finally broke it. If they can move this much here, what must it look like in Chicago or Detroit? Another prisoner, a former U-boat sailor, laughed bitterly. We were told America couldn't fight, that they were weak. But they are not weak. They are infinite. That night, a rare thunderstorm swept through Mississippi. Rain drummed on the roofs of the barracks and lightning flashed across the wire fences. Hans lay awake, listening to the distant hum of generators, the symbol of a nation that never slept. He thought of Germany, of ration cards, fuel shortages, and nights huddled in bomb shelters. He thought of his family, waiting in the dark while American bombers flew overhead. And he finally understood what the Reich had refused to admit. They weren't fighting another army. They were fighting an economy. The American war machine wasn't built to destroy, it was built to endure, to outlast, to overwhelm through sheer production. When dawn broke, the storm had passed. The camp stirred awake under a pale sunrise, steam rising from puddles between the barracks. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called again. Hans sat up on his bunk and whispered to himself, "We were never going to win." Section 6. Industry Without End. May 1943. Somewhere in the American Midwest. A convoy of trucks rattled down a highway lined with endless wheat fields. Inside, 50 German prisoners sat staring out the windows, not at the soldiers guarding them, but at the world beyond the glass. Factories, railroads, power lines that stretched farther than the eye could see. Smoke rising from 100 chimneys, each one part of a vast, humming network that fed the war effort. Their destination? A General Motors plant converted for war production. The POWs had been assigned to assist with menial labor, sweeping floors, unloading parts, stacking crates. But the true lesson came not from their work, but from what they witnessed. The plant was a cathedral of industry. Conveyor belts roared, sparks burst from welders. Women in bandanas and overalls assembled aircraft engines with speed and precision. Above them, a banner read, "The best damn team in the world, let's keep it flying." Hans Meyer and the others stood frozen, staring at the choreography of American production. The noise was deafening, the coordination flawless. Crates of parts moved by pulley, trucks rolled in and out with perfect timing. Every hour, a new machine rolled off the line, an engine for a B-24 Liberator bound for the skies over Europe. A foreman noticed the stunned expressions of the prisoners and grinned. "Don't just stand there," he shouted over the noise. "Grab a broom! We're winning a war here!" Even the guards smiled. To them, this was normal, a Tuesday in America. But to the Germans, it was incomprehensible. Back home, the Luftwaffe engineers were building aircraft in underground tunnels, scraping for aluminum. Here, Workers had chrome tools, electric drills, and surplus material. No shortages, no desperation. Just abundance and rhythm. During lunch break, the prisoners were allowed to sit near the factory's cafeteria. They watched workers line up for sandwiches, coffee, and milk. Hans bit into a soft roll. Fresh, warm, white bread. It crumbled like nothing he'd ever tasted before. The engineer beside him whispered, "This isn't a war factory. It's a miracle." Later that afternoon, they were loaded back onto the trucks. As they left the plant, the convoy passed an enormous billboard by the highway. A picture of a Liberty ship being launched with the slogan, "Built in 4 days, because freedom doesn't wait." The men stared in silence. That ship represented everything they had come to realize: speed, power, coordination, the sheer scale of American production. Hans muttered quietly, "They build ships faster than we can repair them." The others nodded grimly. When the trucks returned to camp that night, the prisoners were exhausted, not from work, but from awe. For the first time, many began writing home, not about the war, but about what they had seen. Some described the cities, others the machines, and one wrote, "If Germany had seen what I saw today, no one would still believe we could win." The war was still raging across the Atlantic, but here, on the other side of the ocean, these men had already glimpsed the outcome, not carved in the ruins of Europe, but forged in the furnaces of America. Section 7. The Moment of Understanding. July 1943, Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. The prairie heat shimmered above the wire fences. A line of German POWs worked silently in the fields, their shovels cutting through the dry red earth. A military truck rolled by carrying crates stamped with bold letters, "Ford Motor Company, Detroit." Hans Meyer looked up as the truck passed and shook his head. Even here, hundreds of miles from any major city, America's industrial fingerprints reached everything. Every hammer, every bucket, every vehicle seemed brand new. That evening, after dinner, the prisoners gathered outside their barracks to escape the heat. Someone had managed to tune a small radio to a local station. The smooth voice of a news announcer filled the night air. "President Roosevelt has announced the United States produced 86,000 aircraft in the last year alone." The men froze. 86,000. They did the math silently. That was more planes than the entire Luftwaffe had built since 1939. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, laughed nervously. "They must be lying." But Hans didn't laugh. He'd seen the factories, the trains, the ships, the billboards. "No," he said quietly, "they're not lying. They're counting." Silence followed. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the faint hum of the camp's electric lights, always on, even at midnight. Power that never failed, fuel that never ran out. In the distance, the rhythmic pounding of a train echoed across the plains. Each sound, each clatter of steel reminded them of what they had lost. One of the officers, Oberfeldwebel Kruger, finally spoke. "When I was captured in Tunisia," he said softly, "I thought America was a land of chaos, no discipline, no order. But now I see, their discipline isn't on the battlefield. It's in their factories." The men nodded. They had fought for a Reich that worshipped order, yet collapsed into ruin. Here, in the heart of their enemy's land, they found order everywhere they looked. In the trains that ran on time, in the food that arrived hot every day, in the bridges that never fell. The following week, the prisoners were taken to help load grain shipments bound for Allied forces overseas. They watched as trucks, conveyors, and cranes moved in perfect sequence. A single dock, one of thousands, operated with clockwork precision, sending food across oceans while German civilians starved. Hans leaned against a wooden crate marked "Flour, U.S. Army," and whispered, "They're feeding the world, while we can't even feed ourselves." Later that night, back in his bunk, he wrote in his journal, a habit he'd begun weeks earlier. "The war is not being fought in Europe anymore. It's being decided here, in these factories, these railways, these endless machines. Germany can fight 1,000 battles, but it cannot fight this." The realization spread quietly among the prisoners, the truth too heavy to deny. They were witnessing a nation that didn't just win wars. It manufactured victory. And in that moment, surrounded by abundance, power, and quiet efficiency, the soldiers of the Reich understood something their leaders never would. The war was over. It just hadn't been announced yet. Section 8. The Aftermath. Lessons of Defeat. March 1945, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Snow blanketed the barracks that morning, softening the edges of the fences and guard towers. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Germany was collapsing. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was surrounded. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years was crumbling after 12. Hans Meyer sat by a small stove with a few of his comrades, reading a newspaper one of the guards had left behind. The headline struck like a hammer. "American industry produces its 100,000th aircraft." He stared at the photograph, workers smiling beside a massive B-29 superfortress. In the image, men and women of every background stood together. Factory girls, mechanics, welders, soldiers, all wearing proud smiles beneath banners that read, "Victory through production." Hans lowered the paper. "They built victory like we build walls," he said softly, "brick by brick, hour by hour." Across from him, Sergeant Otto Weber shook his head in disbelief. "We were told they were soft, that their democracy made them weak, but their freedom made them faster." Outside, the sound of a train whistle cut through the cold air. Through the frosted window they could see it, a long freight train loaded with tanks and trucks heading east. Even now, with victory certain, America's machine never stopped moving. That afternoon, the camp loudspeakers crackled to life. A message in German announced, "Prisoners of war, the conflict in Europe is nearing its end. You will soon be repatriated. You have conducted yourselves with honor. The war is over." But for many of them, the war had ended long before. On factory floors, on rail lines, in fields where machines replaced men. When Germany finally surrendered in May, some prisoners wept quietly. Others stared blankly at the horizon. A few smiled, not from joy, but from the strange comfort of knowing the nightmare was finished. Weeks later, the repatriation process began. The men were given clean clothes, hot meals, and even farewell handshakes from their guards. Before boarding the train that would take them to New York, Hans turned one last time to look at the camp that had changed his life. He thought of the roaring engines, the bright factories, the grocery shelves overflowing with food. He thought of the women welding aircraft wings with steady hands and the workers who never stopped, day or night. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, reflective. "We came here as enemies, but I leave with respect." As the train rolled eastward, Hans gazed out at the passing fields. Endless farms, highways, and small towns stitched together by power lines and railroads. America stretched out before him like an empire of motion,
not built on conquest, but on creation. He realized then that the greatest weapon of the war had never flown or fired a shot. It was the factory, the assembly line, the worker who believed in what he was building. And as the sun set over the horizon, the former soldier of the Reich whispered one final truth to himself. They didn't just win the war. They built a world that never stops.